So you basically recently you presented a webinar with the title, let me see, it's Cloud Economics, Why Hyperscalers Will Cost You More Every Time, which is an interesting title, and we'll get on to discuss that topic in a minute, but it would be good to have a bit of background, your thoughts on the cloud market in general, how you think it's, the good bits, the bad bits, and I guess we can't avoid what impact the pandemic has had in terms of how people are using it, because that's a good place to start.
Yeah, and I'm happy to kick us off here. So, if you look at the data before the pandemic, we really did we did enjoy, as a cloud company and other in the industry, we enjoyed double-digit growth in cloud for all the reasons that everyone already knows: cost savings, efficiency, flexibility, all those benefits. And probably we also experienced an inclined decline in on-premises spending, hardware, et cetera, for the same reason. So, ultimately the trend had been established before COVID, hit us from a global perspective. But with COVID, what I think we saw, and again, just as my pulse of the industry, is, the need to work remote, the inability for IT professionals to actually access their data center, the supply chain problems in getting a physical disk and bringing it to a data center, and I think in some cases the need to divert IT budgets to other areas of the business because of the COVID disruption, all acted as accelerants to the cloud trend that we already saw, that had already been established. Because again, the benefits that we just talked about were no longer, just business improvement strategies. Now, and there's plenty of anecdotes to suggest this is true, that they actually became business survival strategies, in terms of companies actually making it through, given all those different disruptions that happened. I really do think it's that simple. Mark, I'm not sure if you've got any specifics on this yourself from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, echo what you said. Essentially, what's happened over the last 18 months has been an acceleration of stuff that's been talked about for years before the pandemic started. And like Justin said, it's made a lot of companies who maybe had thought about these ideas and concepts as a notional initiative, or, oh, we'll get to that in time, or maybe that's something we'll look at driving, or, oh, our competition's doing that, let's see how it goes for them, and if it works, we might follow suit. It's now, oh, we have to do that.
Yeah.
Like if we don't do what they're doing, we will fail.
That's right.
So it's become imperative rather than an option.
Yeah. One more thing on that is, one of the things that we were well aware of was this idea of cloud first, prior to the pandemic, where, all new applications for companies that are looking at cloud for, future growth and strategies, et cetera, cloud first said, okay, we're going to develop all our new applications in the cloud. And we saw a shift from cloud first to, what we call cloud now, which is not only new applications, but we've got to find a home and we've got to find an answer for these legacy applications that are sitting in a data center that I can no longer access, or that I have, a lower amount of confidence in that I can support during the pandemic. So, again, this has all been an external force, a disruption. But I think even if you look at it from even higher perspective, the cloud in general allows companies to be able to be flexible and to pivot quickly in terms of IT with the cloud versus having a very fixed position in a data center with physical hardware that you own and you manage yourself.
Okay, and we talked sort of about the cloud in a sort of generic term, but clearly there are many flavors, if you like, of cloud. And again, just some thoughts, because you've got, multi-cloud, whether or not that's a good approach. Clearly, hybrid cloud seems to be the prevailing way people are going. But you've got private, public, you've got managed cloud, unmanaged cloud. I say everyone talks about the cloud, but there are lots of sort of nuances within it. Do you have any sort of thoughts as to what works best, or is it literally, all depends on the application, the company, and, just some thoughts on all those different sort of cloud options, if you like.
Yeah, and I'll take this one, and I'll take this one and the next one, because I think they're going to be to some extent related. So from an industry perspective, we message out that the different benefits of all the different types of clouds, and there are lots of different types of clouds, public, private, to your point, whether it's shared resources or dedicated resources, managed, unmanaged. But ultimately, these are cloud is an IT resource delivery model, right? And so like other delivery models, there is no one size fits all. Again, it can be shared, it can be dedicated, it can be managed, it can be unmanaged. There's other variables that can be looked at. But ultimately, it's an IT resource delivery model, and that needs to be reconciled with the needs of the organization, the application side of things, the organizational resources, what time, effort, et cetera, do you have to expend, to deploy a cloud yourself, those kinds of things all come into play. And I think to some extent, the reason why the cloud, industry and the model, all the different variations of it have expanded so much is because there are so many nuances that need to be looked at and reconciled with customers, because everybody's different. Mark, I don't know if you have a view on that.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. There is no one size fits all.
Yeah, that's really the bottom line.
Yeah, you have your different pillars of cloud as well, which we didn't really allude to, which is more the infrastructure as a service, the platform as a service, the software as a service, also generically referred to as cloud. And again, there's options within those. So it's what does the organization need, what's right for that organization, and then progress accordingly. Sometimes you can have public and private and a mix across all three of those. So again, cloud is used very generically, but principally speaking, it is not yours. I think that's probably one of the simplest way of putting it. It is not yours. You are consuming a service one way or another.
That's great.
Okay.
And actually, I'll add one more piece to that. I'll add one more piece to that because I'm old enough to to have been around and to have been marketing storage and IT when we went from a very homogeneous IT environment in the data center. Everything is IBM or everything is EMC, to a heterogeneous environment because customers are looking for specific attributes of that technology. I'm going to have an EMC array over here. I'm going to bring in a pure storage over here, for different reasons, different applications, et cetera. And I think that's what we see with multi-cloud, right? So now you've got companies that, let's say a customer is, writing new applications on Amazon, but they want a disaster recovery solution, for example, something Island does really well. They want to may look at Island because we're a leader in disaster recovery. Now you've got a multi-cloud world, and you've got a little bit of the best of the both worlds. And that's, what we saw years and years ago in the data center move from, a one size, or a one vendor fits all to a heterogeneous environment. I think we've seen that now where customers are choosing clouds based on their actual needs, not necessarily saying I'm going to do all the things in one cloud.
Okay, and I'm guessing the main reason for the chat today is the hyperscalers obviously dominate, and I guess a lot of customers are comfortable with them. They've bumped into them in throughout their IT life or even in their domestic environment. So it's a nice, easy, comfortable choice to go for one of the hyperscalers. But and clearly their sort of upfront offerings also look quite attractive. It looks like it's going to be a low cost option. But in terms of actually understanding sort of an enterprise fit solution, do you think a lot of end users are maybe not either doing their homework, or are they perhaps being slightly misled is maybe a bit harsh word, but it's not as obvious to them what they will end up paying as that headline figure might suggest?
Yeah, I'll take this one, and then I know we're going to get into some more technical questions, and this is where Mark is, one of our experts here. But at the high level, from my response to this question is, absolutely, customers need to be aware, of not only, they need to really understand what they're up against, and I think there's two parts to that. Number one, truly understanding your organization and your application's resource needs. Right. So application performance needs, your networking security, it's a little bit of know thyself. Does your organization have the time and resources to successfully deploy cloud or a solution in the cloud or an application in the cloud yourself? That's number one. And then number two, and I think this is a little more complicated, it's understanding how a service is actually priced for those resources that you used. we actually have a saying in the States here. You've probably heard this. I'm going to contort this a little bit, but I think it'll be clear what I mean. You know, when you're selling the sizzle, you know, not the steak, right? The idea here is that, you know, many companies will sell to you and market to you based on what they think you want, not what you need. And necessarily, you know, that can result in, you know, having a great platform for an aspect of your needs, but not necessarily all of them, right? And so again, it's back to, I need to dig in. I need to understand my resource needs, my application needs. And then I also need to think about, you know, beyond the platform, I need to think about planning, migration. I need to think about, you know, do I need a full management service for this? Being realistic, it's not just about the platform. So it's all the above. And pricing as a result of that can become complicated in many moving parts. So, you know, it is an exercise in and of itself to figure out what resources you need, and then to figure out how it's actually priced across many different providers.
Okay, and moving on to a bit more detail, I guess. One of the areas where there's it's maybe not as obvious as it should be, as to, you know, the cost involved is around the transaction costs. Is that something you can give us a bit of sort of insight into, Mark?
Yeah. So I mean, the best way to look at it is this: when you've come from an environment where you own the infrastructure, you would acquire some hardware, you would put it together and run it in your own data center or data center space. That could be a server room, it could be an actual physical data center. There were elements that you had to take note of, and you had to factor in from a cost perspective: the power consumption. Maybe you were charged for a certain amount of cooling, floor space. You know, there were quantifiable metrics. But once you had those factored, you didn't really have to worry about anything else. You were never sold a storage array and asked to measure how many times you're reading data from the disk. It's your storage array. Once it's in place, that's it. You weren't sold servers for compute and said, I want to know how much traffic traverses in and out of those servers because I'm going to charge you differently. You'll have a different cost model. There was never even a consideration. It was, well, give me the compute. I'm going to buy it. I'm going to pay for it with CapEx. Sure, there's some support and maintenance for the life of the hardware, but by and large, it's paid for. The model is completely different. And generically, the term transaction costs cover it. But the model in the hyperscaler world is, well, we want to charge you for different elements. If you're going to be very busy in our platforms, you need to pay for that activity. If you're going to have a dormant workload, well, you're not really using our system, so we don't need to charge you as much. So instead of having things being pretty much bundled all together, like a CapEx charge for some hardware which you stick in your data center, they've been able to carve out their environment in such a way that if you place a workload that's quiet and doesn't really do much, doesn't use the platform, so we can give you a really low price point. But if you do have a workload that is busy, which quite frankly most enterprise applications are, you know, they're driving a business 9 to 5 at a minimum, well, you need to pay for that usage. So now you're being expected to understand metrics and monitoring and metering rather of your workloads and your applications that you've never had to capture in the past. And you're expected to know those metrics so that you can then identify what it's actually going to cost you. And that's really the nitty-gritty of what we're trying to get at here is organizations are being expected to understand something and have the data for something that they've never had to before. And so they're entering a space expecting, to your point at the start of this discussion, cost savings, but they're being charged for things they've never been charged for before. And those transaction charges, those elements that are now metered, are completely blowing the myth of the cost savings out the water, because they can be 5-fold, 10-fold on the base charges that they see at the front level. And we can go into specifics. I mean, I don't want to kind of ramble on too much, but that's really what this is about.
And whether this is the same as or related, there's also potentially additional fees for what most people would regard as essential services. Is that, I say, similar to what you're talking about? Or is that a different problem in itself?
No, it's common thread. And a really easy way for people to relate to this is Depending on the workload and depending on the organization, some will deem some of those services critical and essential, and how can you not have them? And others will go, well, no, we don't need that because we never needed that. So it's really, it's kind of like within, if you take the UK analogy, which if people would be familiar with, or at least the European analogy of air travel and Ryanair, you know, before you boarded a plane, you got some luggage, you'd expect to get a meal on the flight, etc., etc. Ryanair comes along and go, you want luggage? Oh, you're going to pay extra for that. Oh, you mean you want to choose your seat? Hang on, that's extra. And so the initial headline figure looks really, really cheap. But when you turn it into a normal service flight, where I can bring some luggage, I can choose a seat, and I would like a drink at some point in the 2-hour flight, you're actually paying the same, if not more, than the full service airline. And that's the most relatable analogy I can kind of come up with. So to put it into technology terms, I have a server and I've got some data on that server. I want that data protected. I want it backed up. Oh, you do? Okay, well, we'll charge you more for that. I want some security around that server. You know, I want to make sure I've got some access control, some antivirus, some protection against the threats that exist out there. Oh, you do? Okay, well, you need to pay a little bit more for that because that's not included in the workload cost. And then you start adding these things in. I want to know how my server's performing. Oh, so you mean you want to monitor it? Yes, I want to monitor it. Is it performing well? Is everything working the way I expect it to? Yeah, you can monitor it. That'll cost you more too. So everything that was just assumed to be standard and everyday commonplace in your enterprise before cloud are now individual cost items which need to be factored in.
And in terms of the responsibility, I mean, you give it a nice analogy there with the Ryanair, which I guess most people are familiar with, the budget airline versus the standard. But where do you think the responsibility lies? I mean, obviously, another term for cloud is utility. So we all get utility bills, and we're all urged to look at the small print and see all the T's and C's and all the different tariffs and the rest of it. But what obligation do you think the hyperscalers or cloud providers in general have to point out to people, well, actually, if you want a like-for-like service replacing, your on-prem environment, which we know about, do they have any obligation to do that, or is it entirely up to caveat emptor to do all his or her homework before they take the plunge into any particular service?
So I take the view that the hyperscalers have zero responsibility to inform their customers of this. They're providing a platform with a myriad of services. Their services are fairly well documented. None of what we're talking about today is hidden in fine print. It's actually standard font size on every web page that they publish. The fact is you just have to go out there and read it and educate yourself. The challenge is that there's so much change and the change is so frequent that to stay on top of it is the hard part, and not everyone can afford to give themselves the time or necessarily has the inkling stroke motivation to go out there and do the research. They want the answers handed to them. And so you get that headline statement or that headline goal of, well, you can do more for less, you can save money. And depending on the scenario, yes, you can. This is not an anti-cloud sentiment that we're trying to convey here. We are a cloud provider ourselves, and we're pro-cloud. But the main thing we're trying to say is make sure you understand what you're getting, and you're doing an equivalent comparison. If you take that scenario, we go through those examples we just talked about. Maybe I don't want the workload backed up because it's ephemeral, which means it's temporary in nature. That's not important to me. Maybe I don't need, component X or Y because they're just not relevant for me. If that's the scenario, then that's great because then you don't have to pay for them. So it's really about understanding what you need, doing your homework. The cloud providers are going to give you a platform, a very powerful platform to create new applications, to innovate, to do things differently. But if you don't understand what is and isn't included, that's when you can run into problems.
And I guess that, in the consumer world, we're blessed with these various price comparison websites that potentially help us understand what we're doing, do the hard yards for us. I'm sadly, there's not a cloud equivalent that will do that for you. So there are no shortcuts. And is it fair to say that if you see this amazing, headline price for what IT resources you're maybe wanting to get from the cloud, there's a fairly high chance that it's not as good as it looks. And as you say, the end user should do a bit of digging before they sign on any dotted line.
Yeah, 100%. I'd even go so far as to say, as having worked with one of our customers who was approached by one of the hyperscalers, and they said, we could do your entire environment for X amount. And I won't go into specifics, but they presented a number to this customer of ours. And the customer came back to us and said, they are telling me I can run my workloads for this much. Why are you charging me this much? Our number was a little bit higher than what the hyperscaler presented. And we said, okay, well, let's just do some proper analysis, not some random number that's been pulled out of nowhere. Let's run through what you're running with us today, and let's work out what that number is going to be when if you were to move away. And we'll be fully transparent about it. We'll share everything with you. You can challenge us every step of the way. We ran through the exercise. We said, well, these are your workloads. This is your network environment. This is the data you transfer. These are the security elements you have. This is the data protection elements you have, et cetera, et cetera. Long story short, they're still a customer with us. The bill with the hyperscaler was actually going to be 4 times as big as the initial bill that they put in front of them. And that is just indicative of what happens is you get this headline grabbing, attention grabbing number, which could be your number. Previous experience, again, just another anecdote around this sort of thing. Having worked with an ISV in the past, they were very keen on moving their software to run in the cloud on one of the hyperscalers. And they said, it has to be cheaper. Surely it's going to be cheaper than us running our software packages ourselves. And the answer to that was yes, if you do the following. Yes, it would be cheaper if we switched off this and this between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. If we made this change over here, if we made that change over there. Well, first off, switching things off for certain hours was a non-starter. Can't do that because customers would want access at any time of day. Okay, so we can't do that. So the savings are diminished there. If we change this to that, and we're talking about technology platform changes, okay, well, we could do that, but we can't because that's 2 to 3 years of redevelopment work and we can't spare the development resources. Okay, well, scrap that. We can't save any money there. Long story short, in that analogy, they didn't move the applications to hyperscaler. They kept running them because they'd bought assets and were running it in the most efficient way. So you do have to do your homework. You do have to understand what it is you're trying to run. Is it going to save you anything? And if it's not, then it's not. The hyperscaler cloud is not always the answer. And I think that's probably part of the issue that we have in today's market is people assume it's the answer for everything. And it just isn't. Sometimes it just doesn't work out.
And so, I mean, looking ahead, it's always a bit difficult to predict in the IT industry because things can change very rapidly. But in terms of how the cloud market, do you think there will be, for some of the reasons you've outlined and maybe others, a little bit of pushback against the hyperscalers, that the promise hasn't quite been delivered, as end users thought, hasn't quite been delivered, and therefore companies such as yourselves, which are able to give a bit more sort of granular advice, if you like, and help people make proper comparisons. Is that going to happen? And also, I guess one of the hyperscaler attractions is they are potentially going to do everything. They offer everything for you, but multi-cloud, as I think you alluded to earlier on in the piece, if you do have the inclination and the energy, you are better off potentially sourcing certain application services from different sources and putting together a sort of multi or hybrid cloud solution that best fits your business. I hope that make sense.
Yeah. That's yeah. So let me try answer the first part of that question first. There is pushback already. So I don't think that's coming. I think it's already happened for those that have that were first in, your early adopters. For those where it's worked, brilliant. They've been able to evolve their business, they've been able to change their delivery model and potentially save. One thing that we try and make sure is understood is the cloud isn't necessarily always about saving money. And that's maybe something we should have kind of spelled out at the onset, is sometimes the cloud is an enabler. It's enabling you to enter a new market. It's enabling you to, that could be a vertical or a geography. It's opening up opportunity. And sometimes that comes with additional cost, but the additional cost is worth it. The value trade-off is there. So that's really important, that people shouldn't always look at cloud as a cost-saving initiative only. You're right. So when you take that frame of mind, there are many organizations that have gone out there that are operating very happily on the hyperscale cloud. They might be spending more, but they can do more with it. So, there's that other side to the coin. But in terms of the cost argument, and just cloud in general, those that have gone with the expectation of saving and they really just wanted to maybe close down a data center or stop buying hardware, and they've been burnt, they are going the other way. They're looking at other providers that don't, meter every element of their day-to-day activity, or they're providing a platform that's more compatible with or more familiar to what they need or what they've worked with in the past. And then to the second part of your question, that we see as just an element of organizational maturity with cloud. They have gone, feet first into something, it hasn't worked out, they've maybe taken a step back and realized, well, taking everything and dumping it in another location wasn't the right answer. What is the right answer? And that's when you start to get those combinations of different services. You could have SaaS with something like Microsoft 365 or Salesforce. Okay, that takes care of one part of our environment. What about our HR software? Okay, well, Workday might do it, or another SaaS application, or maybe they don't, and we need to put it somewhere else. Okay, what about our finance system? Okay, well, there's another SaaS offering here, or we need to run it ourselves. And at each layer, organizations are trying to find the best fit for them. The trade-off is balancing the complexity with too many in the multi-bucket. And sometimes what you'll have is organizations will abandon the concept of true multi-cloud, i.e. I've got 15, 20 different services coming together in favor of simplicity. And again, this is kind of alludes to that point about cloud isn't necessarily about saving money. It's you've got to look at the bigger picture. Do I want simplicity? Do I want cost saving? Am I a really lean IT shop and I just can't afford to manage all these different systems? What's the goal? And then once you've established that, then you choose your solutions appropriately.
Okay, that's probably a good place to end. And Justin, aware we haven't tried. Do you have any final sort of thoughts, observations for us as well?
Yeah, I actually have one more that Mark just kind of put in my head, just something to touch on. So just around pushback on the hyperscalers, I think even in our consumer lives, we all live in a world of sort of increasing expectations, higher levels of performance, different levels of security, geographic dependencies. So, more applications, ultimately resulting in a more complex landscape. And so I think smaller providers like iland, and others in our market and our size that are competing against hyperscalers, the value that we're bringing is because we're in a strong position to actually help solve or address that complexity in a better way with people, with experts, with services, again, planning, strategy, all those things that happen, after you've, after you bought your bare bones seat on Ryanair, to Mark's point, right? And so who's in the strongest position to help solve and to reduce that complexity, to create, a sort of single unified plane across all of these things? Smaller providers that have, people that are ready to pick up phone calls, those kinds of things. And right now, I don't think that's the hyperscaler model. I think they've got a great model, obviously, but there's increasing complexity and businesses need to figure out how to do that, and sometimes they need help to do that. So that's how smaller players fit in.
Okay. Well, that's great. I mean, I've enjoyed chatting to both of you today. So, Mark and Justin, thanks very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
You too. This has been great. All right. Thanks very much.
Thanks again.